Chapter 2, Raymond. Applied altruism was the subject of the lecture that afternoon, and the large auditorium at the Chicago University was unusually well filled. Professor Musey was one of the newest acquisitions of the university. His reputation as a philosopher was national, and it was unique. He had struck out along new paths and was linking philosophy and life, ethics and business, in a manner no scholar in America had hitherto attempted. His instance from life, with which to illustrate his lecture that afternoon, Professor Musey had found in a well-known Chicago businessman whose death was of recent memory. He did not speak of the man by name, but referred to him as the merchant prince. As the professor unraveled the career of this merchant prince, various phases of altruism seemed to find their exemplification in life. Everything this man undertook and did during his lifetime, in one way or another, benefited his fellow citizens. As an employer, he had benefited his employees. He was a pioneer in the matter of establishing welfare institutions. As a merchant, he had benefited his clients by his honorable business methods. As a citizen, he had benefited the community by his general acts of philanthropy, by the museums he built, the libraries he founded. Of course, every one of the students knew the name of the merchant prince the professor was speaking of. The very description of the man as a merchant prince came from the newspapers, whose editorial writers never wearied of using it. The mothers and sisters of the students had frequently done their shopping at this man's store. Keen, energetic young fellows, sons of businessmen for the most part, who were themselves looking forward to a business career at the completion of their college course, Professor Musey's students were greatly taken by this presentation of business as a vehicle for the practice and expression of man's highest ideals. They listened eagerly and pleasantly, and their opinion of the professor rose by degrees. Yes, Dr. Musey was not one of the ordinary run of professors. He was not a mere bookworm, they mused. He knew the world. Some of them speculated what might have happened if Professor Musey had himself gone into business. With his ability and ideals, might not he, too, have become a merchant prince like the one he was eulogizing? But be that as it may, Professor Musey was a great man and deserved the fame he was getting. Raymond Everett, a junior in the College of Liberal Arts, was greatly preoccupied with the lecturer, but along different lines. He was searching the professor with his looks and thoughts. The questions of right and wrong, of moral or immoral conduct, which the professor was raising, were poignantly personal with young Everett that afternoon, had been for months. Professor Musey, after having successfully shown the good and the beautiful in the career of the merchant prince, proceeded with a general analysis of some of the burdens and weaknesses of the human race. He unfolded tangled human problems, dissected emotions, laid bare passions. He did this with understanding, with sympathy even, but with a complete personal detachment which to young Everett that afternoon was tantalizing. Was the professor immune to the infirmities of the soul he was conjuring with? Raymond Everett was wondering. Was anyone immune? Had the professor in his own personal life never been troubled with any of the vital, tragic problems and doubts he was raising? Had he never wronged anyone? Never done anything to ruffle his calmness? never been at odds with his conscience? In a word, was the professor's serenity native with him, or was it acquired? Could anyone acquire it? William Howard Musey was a man of 45. He was tall, and his closely cropped beard framed a face that showed none too much of the pallor ascribed to scholars. He was married. Raymond Everett had seen the professor and his wife in a department store where they were sampling cheese like ordinary folks. Professor Musey apparently was no despiser of life. He was a man like all men. He had been a boy once. He had been young. Had he never trifled with girls? Raymond had a sensation as if he were plunging a scalpel deeper and deeper into the soul of the professor. But it was his own thoughts and problems he was in reality laying open. Had the professor ever had relations with girls? Could Professor Musey possibly have had such relations with a girl as he, Raymond, had had with Hilda? And if he had, could the professor have forgotten it? Was it possible ever to forget such a thing? Would he also forget? Would he, too, be able to stand on a platform someday and speak as Professor Musey was speaking, of right and wrong, of justice between man and man? Would he ever be able to get Hilda out of his mind? The voice of the professor now came to him as a faint buzzing. The lecture room, the people seemed to have receded a great distance. Everything had become a blurred mass. Hilda's face alone stood out sharp and clear. He was waiting for Hilda and was getting restless. What made her so late? The whistle had blown long ago. A stream of girls had already left the factory. A smile spread over his face. She always came out late when she knew he was waiting for her. She was taking time to fix up. Yes, the next time he would come unexpected. He liked to meet her unexpected. He liked to see her surprised and pleased look. One of the stained windows in the hall was open. A gust of wind swept through the room. His dream dissolved, and his thoughts were of reality once more. April was gone, and May was here. It was the first week in May. Where was Hilda now? What was she doing? What had become of her? Since that day in September, when the girl had come to their home asking for him, and his father had driven her from the house, there had been no trace of her. For weeks after that visit, he had lived in dread. They had all lived in dread. He was expecting daily to hear from Hilda through a lawyer, through the police. She would sue. She would expose him. She would bring shame upon his family. His sleep was broken and fitful. He could not concentrate upon his work. Instead, he was constantly rehearsing a defense, a denial of her charges, which he was mentally delivering now in court, now before a coroner's jury, for she might have killed herself. The threatened calamity did not come, and after months they began to breathe easier at his home, especially his father. But to him the passing of time brought no ease, no rest. On the contrary, he had often wished that the thing which he had at first considered a calamity had come to pass. He wished the girl had sued him. He would have faced not one but a battery of lawyers only to have certainty. For months he had been haunting the streets through which Hilda formerly walked to and from work. At 6 o'clock every evening he would take up a position a short distance from the factory where she had worked and would watch the crowds that were leaving it, scanning them for her gait and figure. But Hilda was not among them. He had tried the tenement where she lived. He stood vigil under its windows for several nights in succession, but Hilda never showed up. She had disappeared as if in water. Water. Was that the answer? Had the girl drowned herself? She might have. Her body might long ago have been washed ashore by the waters of Lake Michigan. But if Hilda was alive, then there might be a child. Yes, there might, by this time. It was May. A child. He might be a father now. The blood rushed to Raymond's face, and he looked about furtively to see if any one of the students had been observing him. But no one was looking in his direction. Professor Musey was bringing the lecture to a close, and the students were busy scribbling down names of books for reference reading. The weather was superb. It was the first warm spring day. As the students rambled out of the building, many of them separated into couples and started down the campus in the direction of the lake. Others strolled down that way singly. It was the last recitation with most of them, and it was a delightful afternoon for a walk. Raymond Everett was standing on the steps of Arts Hall, undecided. His parents lived at the other end of Chicago, but he was in no hurry to get home. He was thinking whether to go down to the lake or start in the direction of the city. "Glorious weather, isn't it?" A girl's voice rang out beside him. "How do you do, Miss Straight?" Raymond greeted her. "Yes, a fine day." Young Everett has been trying to lighten his work that year, and he had drifted into a course on labor problems. The course was taken mostly by seniors, graduate students, and social settlement workers. There were no textbooks, and the lectures by the professor seemed like a running commentary on things one was reading in the newspapers. In this class, he and Miss Straight occupied adjoining chairs. They also met in one or two other classes. Maud Straight was a resident at one of the social settlements in Chicago and was taking special work at the university. She was not as tall as Everett, with whom she would often walk out of the lecture room, but she was stronger built than he. She was very fair and inclined to plumpness. Everett never could tell whether this detracted from her looks or added charm to her soft, inviting features. She was very friendly and had a more comprehensive understanding of economic and labor questions than he. At her invitation, Everett had twice visited the social settlement in which she was a worker. The effect of these visits was to enhance greatly the respect which he already felt for her. They also served to intensify the discrepancy in their ages. The young woman was going at the solution of certain private and domestic problems among the people in the district with the mind of a mature, businesslike person. He judged her to be at least 5 years older than himself. In Miss Straight, the nearer acquaintance with Everett evoked different feelings. She was interested, in fact, a bit puzzled by his quiet, retiring disposition. He looked and acted like a man who was laboring under a handicap. She was wondering what that handicap might be. It could not be a matter of health, for apparently he was healthy. They were not yet sufficient friends to touch upon intimate matters. They had walked down the steps. Miss Straight was talking about Professor Musey's lecture. She was appreciative and enthusiastic over it. All the time she spoke, Everett was conscious, however, that she was waiting for him to ask her for a stroll to the lake. He had taken such a stroll with her once before. He was on the point of doing so, but the desire to be alone won out. He said something about having to rush off home. Miss Straight extended her hand to him. She did not believe that he was busy, but she saw that his desire to be alone was genuine. Something was pressing on his mind. She shook his hand warmly. There was a fellow feeling and sympathy in it. Raymond plunged straightway into his thoughts about Hilda. He was passing through one of the poorer sections, and it seemed to him as if he had come into the midst of a holiday crowd. On the curbstones and in the gutter, children were playing. Windows were wide open, and each window framed the head of a mother. Girls of 8 and 9 were dancing to the tune of a hurdy-gurdy. They reminded him of himself and Hilda many years back at their old home in Wisconsin. If he could only shake off his years, shake off college, the city, and get back to where they were then. Gad, he vociferated inwardly, if only he had not left the old town, if his father had not got the notion of Chicago. Except for those months with Hilda, Chicago had given him no happiness. He was passing a cleaning and dyeing establishment located in an old frame building. The shop was on a level with the sidewalk. Inside, a young Jew was sitting astride a table and was sewing in a sleeve. His girl wife was sitting on a chair outside the door. She was holding on to a baby carriage in which an infant was sleeping, her gaze constantly darting to her husband. Every time their eyes met, they exchanged smiles. They were lovemaking without words. Raymond stopped in front of the shop window, pretending to be interested in the cloth samples displayed there. In reality, he was gazing at the young tailor and his wife and was thinking how little was necessary to make people happy. An immense loneliness came over him. What would become of Hilda if she had a child? What had he done to her? The park was visible a few blocks away. He started toward it, turned in, and walked along secluded lanes. He wished to be alone, unseen.